This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horror, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Brandon Applegate about the new collection, It Was All a Dream, Volume 2. Hungry Shadow Press is an independent publisher specializing in horror, weird, and dark short fiction, such as the It Was All a Dream anthology series, The First 5 Minutes of the Apocalypse, and One Day We Will Die, as well as the weekly web feature, Deadly Drabble Tuesdays. Editor-in-Chief Brandon Applegate is a writer, editor, multimedia designer, and marketer living outside of Austin, Texas, with his wife and 2 kids. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here.
Icebreaker question. Have you ever seen a sleep paralysis demon?
Ooh, good question. I have not seen a sleep paralysis demon myself, but there's an old family story. My uncle swears up and down that he saw one of them floating right over his face and ended up running down the street with no pants on over it. So
And that was an uncle, you say?
that was an uncle. That was not me. I promise it wasn't me.
Has this ever happened? Asking for an uncle. Not me. I think I've only ever seen one, and it wasn't scary. It was more annoying. My alarm was going off for school, and I didn't want to get out of bed. And I looked over, and there was like a little blue guy sitting on my alarm clock. And I was begging him to turn it off, and he refused.
Oh my God. That guy was messing with you.
Yeah, that guy sucked. By way of background, why short stories?
I don't actually know why. It's just always been something that I love. Ever since I started reading, I enjoyed short stories. Some of the earliest things that I remember enjoying, like when I actually started reading for myself, were Goosebumps books, which was like a kid's novel. And then oftentimes it would be true ghost story compilations that I would get from the library at school. And those always really kind of manifested as collections of short stories, even if they were purported to be true or however it worked. It always worked out in the span of like 10 pages per story. So it's just something that I was exposed to extremely early on. It's just something that carried through into the rest of my reading. I always preferred, like when I read Stephen King or when I read other, horror authors, I always pick up their short story collection first. It's the first thing I do. Over time, I think I've kind of narrowed the reasoning down to like, if you can punch me in the gut that hard in such a short space of time, imagine what you can do with more space. It's almost like a trial run.
That leads us to drabbles. Can you define a drabble?
100 words, no more, no less. There's something really fun about that restriction. When I first started trying to write seriously, one of the first places that I wrote for was a Medium publication that only ran 50-word stories. It was called the Friday Fix. Every Friday, they would drop a whole boatload of 50-word stories, and I used to write one every week for that. I never missed it. There was something really fun in that formative period for me of writing something that short, but if I came in at 47, I had to add 3 more. What are the 3 most interesting words I could add? Or if I came in at 56, I had to cut 6, but how in the heck are you supposed to cut 6 words out of this? I already have so little. And it's just such a fun exercise to try and hone what you're trying to say to such a precise degree. And I think it's a really important exercise for me when I was starting, and I still do it. So I like to provide a space that gives other people an incentive to do that same thing and maybe find that too.
Did any of those end up in your first collection, Those We Left Behind and Other Sacrifices?
Funny you ask. No, the 50-word version did not, but one of the stories in there actually came from one of those 50-word Medium stories that I wrote for Friday Fix.
Does Those We Left Behind refer to the 6 extra words you had to cut?
No. Well, it's actually the title of the last story in the collection, which is more sci-fi. I really kind of ping around in that book. Yeah, no, I spent a lot of time cutting words for that book, so it was a lot more than 6.
What did you learn from that project that you have applied to Hungry Shadow Press?
Everything. I mean, it was a self-published project. Before I did that book, I honestly didn't know how to do any of this. So I had no idea how to work Ingram Spark. I had no idea how to deal with KDP. I had no idea how to create the files and formats that I needed to create in order to upload the work at all. I had no idea how to format a book. There's just 1,000 different little tiny skill sets that kind of lend themselves to what I'm usually good at, which is these sort of vague creative projects. But you have to learn each one of them individually. And a lot of self-published authors, what I hear most of the time is like, I self-publish because I love the granular control, but when I don't want to self-publish, it's because I don't want to be responsible for all this granular control. It's really the best thing and the worst thing about being a publisher. Everything that I know how to do that allows me to do that for other people in the form of a publisher, I learned from publishing my own book.
Your latest project is It Was All a Dream, an anthology of bad horror tropes done right, Volume 2. So why tropes?
The origin story of that whole series is kind of funny. I have a set of friends that I hang out with in a Discord, and we were literally throwing around what is the worst anthology idea you can come up with. And, I think somebody came up with a politically themed anthology that I won't get into. That was funny, and we all came up with some pretty ridiculous ideas. And mine, I just sort of lobbed into the chat, was an anthology of bad horror tropes. Just thinking about like a whole book full of cats jumping out of cabinets, and just the worst horror tropes from movies or books that you could think of. But for some reason, that one stuck in the conversation, and we kept throwing them back and forth at each other, these ideas about bad horror tropes. And then after, like, I don't know, 5-10 minutes of doing that, it was like, oh, this might actually be a good idea for a book. Like, we're having so much fun just talking through what are our least favorite and most favorite tropes and what kind of story we would actually write out of that trope. So because of that whole conversation, I just was like, well, I don't honestly know why I thought I could do any of the things that I do now. I just decided I wanted to try it. And so it was, okay, so if I want to make an anthology, what do I have to do? Well, if I want somebody else to publish my anthology, then I have to write this pitch document. I have to approach all these publishers, and there's the same thing that goes on in my writing all the time. You get rejected, you get accepted, you get rejected, you get accepted, but you get rejected way more than you get accepted. And I knew that avalanche was coming at me, and I just thought, well, I know how to do this from publishing my own book. I know how to get this book out there. Can I do it myself? So when you say why tropes, it's like because it was so much fun to talk about, and then I just wanted to push it forward. I wanted to push it forward so much that I just didn't really stop thinking about it until it came out. But I have a love for tropes. I don't know if you've ever seen something like Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of my favorite TV shows of all time. I love reveling in things that should be, maybe aren't, but should be silly or goofy or, outlandish. And this just seemed to fit that bill.
Everyone already knows what the tropes are, so that's your hook. And there's a promise in an anthology of short stories, specifically one subtitled Bad Horror Tropes Done Right, is that there will be a twist that subverts the expectation. It's really clever.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that and finding that in it. One of the things that I really love about the idea is that it's almost a challenge to the reader, right? Because I don't tell you specifically what the tropes are until the end of the book. There's a story note section at the very end that's going to go over every single trope that's in there. All the authors are going to talk about their encounters with the trope and how they attempted to subvert it or not, depending on how they approached it. But just reading through the stories themselves, the title almost dares you to be like, guess which one it is. Because one of the other funny things that I see happen all the time is somebody will write a story and they'll be like, I attempted to write a story about a cat jump scare, and I ended up writing a story about a cat jump scare and these 3 other tropes because they all just sort of fell into it. It's so fun to watch sort of what tropes fall in accidentally. And then when you're reading it, as the reader, you go like, well, okay, I'm going to take this challenge to find the trope, and you might find the wrong one.
What I like about picking on a trope that bothers you, as a writer, it's like the grain of sand that the pearl forms around. Any writer worth their salt will be like, how can I flip it? How could I redeem this and use it or elevate it? That's such a fun challenge.
Yeah, I love the idea of challenging both the reader and the author in this case. A lot of the times, the calls that I post up when I want to make an anthology, they're intended to be unique challenges for the author. Part of what I was hoping would happen with this series is that authors would use this in a cathartic way. I've had some authors approach it to say, like, there are tropes that align to neurodivergence that always upset me because I am neurodivergent and I'm going to write this story because that trope bugs the hell out of me and I want to flip it on like this very personal level. And then there are other authors who go like, man, I've always hated cat jump scares, or like I keep using that example, which by the way, in volume 2, Tom Coombe, the author, actually did write one that was based on cat jump scare. And that is one of the most bizarre stories.
The Long People.
The Long People is so brilliant.
Yeah, very moody, very creepy.
Oh my God. Yeah. And wait till you see the artwork that I commissioned from our interior artist. Christopher Castillo Diaz has worked with me on both volumes. He really nailed it. It's just such a creepy story with such a great vibe. And the artwork just really makes it shine too. I can't wait for people to see it.
Why was it important for you to include interior artwork for this collection?
For both books in the series now, there's been interior artwork. I think there's something about this kind of book that I'm always trying to attach to. I just did a whole interview with William Sterling on his podcast.
Hey, Killer Mediums.
Yeah, Killer Mediums.
Friend of the show, William Sterling.
Oh, yeah, no, I love William. And I just did an interview with him regarding EC Comics because Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, and Haunt of Fear, those were the two that were probably more formative for me because I had several contraband issues that I hoarded in my room that my parents couldn't find. My next project literally is a comic book that I'm running like an anthology. I'm always trying to like connect these two mediums because they're both so formative for me in my writing and my enjoyment of this genre. I'm trying to kind of push horror fiction and horror comics together. And I think this was really my first attempt to try and put that together, is to find an artist like Christopher who could draw in the style of these brilliant old school EC style artists and put his artwork right next to some of these bizarre stories. One of the things that I love so much about the community that we're in is that I am so constantly surrounded by people who think totally differently from me, and it's beautiful. And being able to see that represented in fiction in a way that brings these two mediums that I love very close together, very important for me.
Are there any stories in Volume 2 that you would like to focus on?
There are so many. Actually, Volume 2 of Dream is the longest anthology HSP has put out to date. And that's just because I'm never 100% sure which anthology is going to be my last one in the series. I might do another one, I might not. And so I wanted to be really sure to make it include everything, like if it ended here, I'd be okay. And so there's like 29 stories in this anthology, which is very long for anything that I've ever published. I picked every one of these stories because I love them to death. We Are Words is the first story by D. Matthew Urban. Dave is an unbelievable author of weird horror and one of the most amazing people I've seen approach this genre in a while. He does this brilliant story about, the trope is the cursed book, think the Necronomicon from the Evil Dead, but the main characters are the words in that book. They literally talk to each other. It's such a clever idea, and it does so much to illustrate the power of intent when it comes to words is the whole point of that story. It's beautifully done. Like, I could keep going through these. Joe Koch's Untitled with Demon is just a fever dream at war with linear time. Like, it's wild, but Joe's unbelievable at that. I got to work with my HWA mentor, because I'm in the Horror Writers Association, and the main reason I signed up was to do the mentorship program. And I was paired with Rena Mason, who's a Bram Stoker award-winning author, and she worked with me for the longest time trying to whip my writing into shape in some way, shape, or form. And now I actually get to publish one of her stories in Three Sister Stars. That's a huge privilege. So, I would talk about all 29 of them if we had that kind of time. This is a really special batch for me.
I kind of love the fact that we're not picking out any one story and we're just kind of reveling in the pool that you've created. I could also toss out a few, but there are so many good ones. I feel like you were very brave in putting forward some really challenging, surreal stories like The American Dream. is so lush and gorgeous, but it is trippy.
Yep. Yelena Crane is somebody I've featured in Deadly Drabble Tuesdays as well, and I believe in Apocalypse Book as well. Just a brilliant author all around. And yes, so trippy and surreal, and it takes you some time to sort of find the horror in it, but when you do, it's very Blade Runner. It's very Ridley Scott in feel and vibe, even though there's no cyborgs involved.
It walks that line of being disorienting and then gripping you with the actual story.
I agree. When horror authors write, more often than not, we're writing about what scares us, right? In some way or form. It's not all the time, of course we stretch and we go outside of our own experience. But when we really write a good scare, oftentimes we share it. We're scared of that too. I think too much of the time horror tries too hard to skew into the blood, the injury, the physical, immediate danger is what I am afraid of here. I know I'm guilty of that. So much of my work deals with physical, immediate danger. But Yelena has really asked herself the question, like, what really scares me? And it's so much more existential and it's so much deeper and more psychological. And yeah, no, that's an incredible story. I agree.
Another story that was similarly trippy and really just blew me away was Birth of a Sucker.
I love that one. One of my, yeah, I mean, I keep wanting to say one of my favorites, but I love them all very much, so it's very difficult. I'll just say it about every one you talk about.
There's this great conceit in the story where this woman is becoming something else. She's either devolving or evolving, but whatever it is, she is transitioning away from being purely human, and she stops seeing other people and other things the same way that we parse reality. She sees things as individual floating blobs, including people's words, take on little three-dimensional shapes of their own. It creates such a unsettling effect.
I feel like that is one of the more mindful stories I've ever read. This is a story by Briar Ripley Page, and Briar is excellent at being so mindful of the inner workings of the character that the story can take place entirely within the character's head. So often we discard so many of our thoughts. We have this like story that we tell ourselves about the linear progression of our thought progress, right? But there's all this stuff that's happening all around all the time, and you have to actually pay attention and know the inner workings of your own mind to be able to interpret a lot of the stuff that happens kind of just outside of your peripheral. And Breyer does such a good job of making this character's experience real through that. Right, like through the utilization of following every single thing that the mind and the body are doing. It's brilliant body horror and it's brilliant anxiety horror, and they kind of get mashed together. It's wonderful.
It's like neurological body horror. It's the mind coming undone, and it's really scary. It's gory. It's got a great twist. There's all these other cool things going on for it.
It's called Birth of a Sucker, so it's not too much of a stretch when you find out the main character's turning into something to know that the intent is vampire. I don't think I've ever actually seen or read anything that treats vampires in exactly this way. And it's startling. It's literally startling.
So two stories that seem to share a common theme would be When the Motherfucker Just Won't Die and Be Kind, Please Rewind.
Yep.
These are your final girl stories.
Yep. And there's been at least one final girl story in each of the volumes. The first volume was a story about the literal final girl in the world and what it means to be the last person on Earth, just you and one other person that wants to kill you because he's killed everyone else. That was such a creative and incredible story. I wasn't even sure if I was going to include another final girl story in volume 2. And then I got these two, When the Motherfucker Just Won't Die, which, my God, that title is like one of my favorites. And it's by Tiffany Michelle Brown. That story, it looks at it from the angle of if you can't kill the killer, but you can trap the killer, and the killer has done these horrible things to you. What do you do with that person? And I won't dig into it too much, but I will tell you that I've read quite a bit of Tiffany's work, and this may be the strongest I have ever seen her voice come through in a piece of her writing. It is an incredible piece of work. And then Gwendolyn Keist's Be Kind, Please Rewind is this wonderfully clever take on the killer that won't die. Like, why won't the killer die? The answer is because he literally can't, because he has this ability to travel back in time that kicks in every time he dies. And how does the final girl who learns that then turn around and use that to try and turn the tables? Both of them are incredibly clever takes on the idea of the final girl. Both of them turn the final girl into a protagonist, if not a hero, and really center that experience and examine things like the desperation of being relentlessly tormented and the idea that it may seem like it's over at the end of the movie, but it's never really over. The trauma that occurs and the aftermath of it. Both of them really center that experience, but they do it in a way that's just a few picks off of each other. I think that they are both incredible takes and very worth hearing and reading and being seen. Come over to the website and get it. It's up for pre-order right now. I don't know when this will air, so as of the time of this recording, it's up for pre-order, but it'll remain available to buy in the shop on my site, hungryshadowpress.com, even after it's released. But at that time, it'll also be on Amazon and all those great places too. I will tell you that, as is the case for so much of independent horror publishing, a lot of heart and soul goes into the stories. A lot of heart and soul goes into the selection of the stories and how they're showcased. We love the artwork that we get to put out, from the editing to the writing to the artwork itself, and we hope you do too.
What can you tell us about your next project, Vault of Shadows?
Vault of Shadows is going to be fun. Now, instead of pushing horror comics a little bit into anthologies of short stories, now I'm pushing anthologies of short stories into horror comics. The idea actually came from my wife, because we were sitting in the car together talking about my projects, and she was like, why don't you just do this? But the idea is to approach a horror comic from the open call anthology lens. Something in the vein of Tales from the Crypt or Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear, those types of comics. But one, updated with a more modern perspective. There are more perspectives available in the horror community than ever before, and so I want to be sure to showcase voices that weren't always showcased in this format, but also just to approach it from that open call perspective of, I'm going to choose from 400 stories. I was originally going to do no more than 5 stories in the anthology. I may do 6 just because I've got 400 stories. It's so hard to pare it down to 5 or 6. I'm lucky enough to have already sourced a brilliant artist in Christopher Castillo-Diaz. Artem Astaroth on social networks for anybody who wants to seek him out. His abilities are incredibly diverse as an artist. You know, he and I have worked together so often that it's like, okay, at this point, he knows exactly what I'm looking for when I send him something to draw. Like, we kind of read each other really well. I don't have to go source an artist at this point. I have the artist. I already know who I'm going with. I know what the art style is going to be. We're ready to rock. It's so much easier to approach it as though it's an anthology open call. The outcome of this is going to be hopefully a really bloody, gory, heartfelt, crazy, wackadoo sort of homage to everything I loved when I was growing up.
Different topic. You're in the southern wilds of Texas?
Correct. Yeah, I'm just outside Austin.
Are there any local legends, lore, monsters, cryptids, anything like that?
I know there's a few around here, but they all tend to have pretty similar flavors to stuff that I grew up with. My personal favorite that I've had like direct experience with as far as local legend and cryptid stuff is where I grew up. Also in Texas, we had a Goatman Bridge. You know, you park on top of the Goatman Bridge and honk your horn a certain amount of times with your lights off. He was supposed to come out and get you. Yeah, I did that a few times. Never saw the Goatman.
So you had to keep going back?
Yeah, you gotta keep going back. You never know. Maybe the Goatman wasn't home that day, you know? Maybe he's got a busy schedule. I always think those kinds of urban legends like that are a ton of fun, and we have a boatload of them here in Texas. I think the big cryptid in Texas is the chupacabra, right?
Yeah.
But I've never seen one of those. Most of the time when people say they found a chupacabra, it just kind of looks like a sad dog.
Dog with mange, yeah, very sad. Have you heard the legend of El Muerto?
Muerto? No, I don't think I have.
This is one that goes way back to the 18th century. Back when the border was disputed between Texas and Mexico, it essentially was a lawless no man's land.
Okay.
And that's where the outlaws would hide. The worst of the worst were, of course, the cattle thieves, the horse rustlers. Everyone hates them. There was no punishment they could deliver to these outlaws and thieves that would dissuade them.
Right.
So eventually they called in the Texas Rangers.
Okay.
And legend has it that one of these Texas Rangers was a particularly notorious sociopath, Creed Taylor. They sent him and Bigfoot Wallace after the outlaw Vidal. When they finally found him, they did not try to capture them alive. They gunned down Vidal and his whole crew, and then to send a message to the other horse thieves and cattle rustlers, they decapitated Vidal, strapped him to his horse, and sent him off into the desert.
Oh,
and over the years, this headless rider would be spotted and was referred to as El Muerto.
Dude. That's right up my alley. I love that kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff I grew up with. That's an incredible story. I love that. There's a flavor to our ghost stories in Texas that is very, very visceral. The comeuppance is quick and ugly.
Did you guys celebrate Halloween?
We definitely had Halloween, but one thing I found funny about celebrating Halloween in Texas is the number of very religious individuals who were angry that it even existed. It felt high. You know, like that number felt a little bit high. And I had a friend when I was a kid. His parents were in that camp. They were very anti-Halloween, thought it was the devil's holiday, all this stuff. But he was able to talk them into allowing him to come trick-or-treating with me one time. I don't know, we must have been 10 years old, something like that. And we went out trick-or-treating, and, you know, my mom's driving us around from block to block or whatever, and we'll go up and down the block. And some high school kid, I guess, in a scary costume jumped out of some bushes and scared the dog shit out of us, just scared us real bad. But he would not get out of the car for the rest of the night. I got all the rest of the candy. He just stayed in the car. I haven't seen that guy in years. I totally shared my candy with him, just so you know.
Okay. Sure. And then your uncle went running down the street without his pants on. Where can our listeners find you online?
You can find all of my work and Hungry Shadow Press's work at hungryshadowpress.com. Can come directly to my page by just going to bapplegate.com or hungryshadowpress.com. I'm also still active on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Instagram, Facebook to share news and updates about what we're doing. So that's a great place to find us.
Brandon, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Jeff, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast. And thank you for all the wonderful questions. This has been fun.
Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular. You're the first person to see my new podcast.
I was gonna say, it's nice, man.
It's a good thing you can't see the rest of the room. That's all in boxes and shambles and disarray.